Yalmith, everyone. My name is Fahim Gulamali, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversations series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, in the spirit of social justice, land acknowledgement, and recognizing the history and exploitation of Indigenous peoples, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the ancestral lands of the Ayes, Appalachia, Calusa, Timucua, and Tacobaga tribes in the Central Florida region. Each of us on this call today are speaking from the territories of various Indigenous peoples and tribes, some treatied and some unceded. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of an ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands, and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. Today, we're talking about voting and faith, exploring justice and equity. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore, number one, inequities in the justice system and discriminatory practices. Number two, the impact of mass incarceration. And number three, how and why working to improve those who are either incarcerated or at risk of being incarcerated is a critical part of our faith. During this session, you will see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce our wonderful panelists briefly. Dr. Rahil Rojiani is a resident physician in Harvard's community psychiatry program at Cambridge Health Alliance. Inspired by their Ismaili faith, growing up in the wake of 9/11, Rahil began their trajectory of activism in high school. While an undergraduate at Brown University, they continued to be involved in social justice community organizing while also creating their own major in contemplative studies, a multidisciplinary study of meditation, neuroscience, and philosophy of mind. While at Brown and throughout medical school at Yale, they conducted years of research on the neuroscience of healing modalities like meditation and drumming. As a trained mindfulness and meditation teacher, they regularly facilitate workshops for activists and people of color to heal through individual and collective trauma. Rahil's interest in the criminal justice system stems from their work to bring healing practices to incarcerated men, as well as Rahil's frequent clinical interactions with those in the systems, which highlights the pervasive trauma and inequities driving injustice. As an abolitionist, they dream of a just and compassionate world in which prisons and police are obsolete. Rahil is dedicated to the intersection of social justice, spirituality, and somatic healing for collective liberation. Saraa Basaria is a commercial litigation attorney at Todd & Weld LLP in Boston, concentrating her practice on commercial disputes, employment law, and criminal defense. She also works on pro bono and civil rights matters. Prior to joining Todd & Weld, Saraa was a civil litigation attorney at a national law firm where she represented clients in a variety of matters, including commercial litigation, construction litigation, professional liability, land use and zoning litigation, and employment disputes and counseling. She began her career as a public defender with the Committee for Public Counsel Services, representing indigent defendants in district court proceedings in Brockton, Roxbury, and Dorchester. Saraa has a passion for social justice and community engagement. She served as president of the South Asian Bar Association of Greater Boston and on the board of directors of the South Asian Bar Association of North America. She has served as secretary of the board of trustees of the South Asian Bar Association of North America Foundation since 2019. She is a 2017 graduate of the Massachusetts Bar Association's Leadership Academy and serves as treasurer of the MBA's Young Lawyer Division's board of directors and is a member of the Diversity Task Force. Saraa also serves on her firm's diversity committee. She's a member of the Women's Bar Association's Women's Leadership Initiative, which is a program that brings together senior women attorneys and up-and-coming stars of the legal profession for leadership development and mentoring. She was named an up-and-coming lawyer by Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly in 2019, was named a Super Lawyers Rising Star in 2019 and 2020, and was a member of Best Lawyers in America's Ones to Watch list in 2020. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. We would further like to note that Saraa is not here to provide legal advice and is not offering legal counsel to the audience. Let's then turn to our conversation. To kick things off, can you share some of your background and work in the justice system?
So as Fahim mentioned, my name is Rahil Rojiani. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a psychiatry resident at Cambridge Health Alliance. And that is actually the primary way through which I'm engaging with the justice system. Unfortunately, our justice system is our largest mental health institution. And because of that, and because of the relationship between how many folks are incarcerated and who have mental health concerns, I frequently interact and see them in the hospital systems and an outpatient basis, working with them to improve their mental health. I've also done a significant amount of research, including qualitative work, interviewing incarcerated men, while doing some work to bring healing modalities, including drumming, to incarcerated men in a halfway house. So I've gotten to interact with a lot of the folks through the system and seen it from their eyes in that perspective as well.
Thank you, Rahil. Saraa?
Hi, everyone. So as Fahim mentioned, I started my career as a public defender. That meant that I represented people who had been arrested and charged with crimes in district court who could not afford an attorney. The Supreme Court has ruled that in the United States, if you're charged with a crime and you can't afford an attorney, you have the right to counsel, meaning that the government is required to provide you with counsel, pay for counsel for you if you can't pay for counsel yourself. That's how public defenders' offices were born. So I started my career as a public defender. For 3.5 years. I represented folks who were involved in the justice system. They were charged with crimes. There was a lot of intersection with mental health issues, addiction issues, extreme poverty, and a whole host of other concerns. Since I joined private practice, I have continued to be involved in the criminal justice system, both by doing pro bono work and by retaining private clients. I'm currently a member of GLAAD's pro bono list, which means that it's a resource for LGBTQIA+ folks who are involved with the criminal justice system, and they contact GLAAD and they say, do you know somebody who can do pro bono work, who can represent me in criminal court, and who has a sensitivity to issues I may be facing as an LGBTQIA+ person? And I represent those folks for free.
Awesome. I like meditation and I am in law school. And so this is a super exciting conversation, especially given the heavy nature of the topic. And I think that each of you has a unique perspective to bring to the table. And I'm excited to move into my next question, which is to Rahil. How has your faith informed the work that you do?
My faith has grounded me throughout my life and is at the center of my engagement with social justice work. I actually think of 3 core values that myself and some other Smileys working towards social justice have come to understood as the underpinning of this work. For me, first and foremost, Bismillah Rahman Rahim, right? We invoke Rahmah in the fundamental quality of Rahmah, of love and compassion, that is Allah. Before we start every except one surah in the Quran, right? So Rahmah, that deep grounded interconnection of all beings that is fundamentally about love, is absolutely central. Of course, love alone is not enough. Sometimes we can take unskillful actions out of love. So that also means, for me, hikmah or wisdom is central to how I operate in the world, right? To understand power, privilege, and oppression and how that plays out, how that causes harm, and how we can best look towards working through that. That is hikmah to me. And finally, Adil. Adil is justice. Al-Adil, God is the embodiment of justice. And Hazrat Ali talks about Adil, particularly in his early sermons and also in the famed letter to Malik al-Ashtar. Justice is about putting everything in its proper place to be in right relationship. So for me, it is the most action-oriented in the sense that how do I be in right relationship to myself, to Allah, to each other, and to this earth? That to me, like the embodiment of the wisdom and compassion is justice.
Amazing. It's really important to think critically about why you're doing the work that you're doing. And for many of us that are tuning into this conversation, I think that a driving force is faith. And you beautifully broke down why Ismailism, Islam in particular, drives many of our passions to showing up for other people. Now turning more to a technical question, just so that we all have a foundation of where we are all starting from when we're talking about the justice system. I have a two-part question for each of you. Saraa, you can start answering first. Number one, what is the justice system? Can you help define the various pieces to the justice system? And number two, what are some of the inequities and discriminatory practices that you've witnessed in the justice system? And I can repeat those questions for you.
Sure, I might need you to repeat part two when I'm done with part one. So what is the justice system? The justice system is the system by which the government purports to process alleged violations of crimes. So there are several key players involved in the justice system. We may have heard these things on TV, on podcasts, in the news. It's important to figure out who each person is and what they do. So the prosecutor or the district attorney is the attorney that represents the government that prosecutes crimes on behalf of the government. And so, of course, the step before that is the police. Who are the police? The police are government paid, government trained people who are the people who are supposed to respond to alleged violations of crime. Often the way a case gets to a prosecutor is police create a report and a complaint is filed, and then it's on a prosecutor's desk, and it's the prosecutor's job to prosecute this crime and to obtain a conviction. That is the prosecutor's job. Their objective is to obtain a conviction. I say often because sometimes what happens is an individual can go to their local police precinct or their local courthouse and make a report of an alleged violation of a crime. That also can happen. So the prosecutor, as I said, sometimes called prosecutor, sometimes called district attorney, sometimes called U.S. attorney if we're talking about the federal system, sometimes called the government, all the same person, paid by the government official, and works with the police in the sense that the police work for them, investigating the crimes for them and provide them with the evidence to prosecute this crime. The person who's charged with the crime is a person known as a defendant, and the person representing this person will be either a public defender. And so a public defender is somebody who represents a person charged with a crime. And the public defender is also paid by the government, but they are paid and their offices are completely different than the prosecutor's office. As a public defender, I can tell you that my paycheck came from the government, but I did not work for the government. As a public defender, your focus, your advocacy is for your client. A criminal defense attorney is just a public defender that's paid on a private basis. So a public defender and a criminal defense attorney, same thing, different source of income. So other folks involved in the criminal justice system might be investigators. Prosecutors and defense attorneys both employ investigators to, you guessed it, investigate a crime, figure out what happened, what didn't happen, what's alleged, what's not alleged. Are there photographs? Are there surveillance tapes? Are there witnesses that we can speak to? And so witnesses, again, another part of the justice system, people who claim to have witnessed a crime or claim to have been the victims of crimes. Also social workers. So oftentimes the public defender's office will employ a whole set of social workers. As I mentioned before, When I was a public defender, a lot of my work intersected with mental health, addiction, poverty, a combination. More than those issues, a lot of things can be going on that lead somebody to involvement with the justice system. So social workers are a key part of a defense attorney's team. Beyond that, we have jurors. So a juror would be anybody who's on this webinar may get a jury summons. You go to court, and it could be for a civil case or a criminal case. And a juror is the fact finder. So you sit along with other jurors during a trial. You're given a bunch of evidence, and you make the determination in the criminal setting. You make the determination as to whether the crime happened or not, whether this person is guilty or not. And if your state has this set up, you're sometimes involved in the sentencing phase of this criminal trial. So those are the players. And of course, there are many more, and we could go in much more detail, but that's, I think, good for now.
Saraa, so you just gave like a summary of my entire class that I'm taking this semester, and I love that so much. Can you just give like a TLDR, like number one, alleged crime happens, number two,
Sure.
all the way to sentencing, so that everyone can kind of follow the trajectory of a procedural kind of history of criminal defense or the criminal system?
Sure, happy to do it. So let's say there's a dispute between two people on the street, and person A and person B get into a physical altercation. Person C calls the police. So person C is now a witness, and the police come to the scene of this alleged crime. The police, in theory, will talk to each person and will make a determination on who they believe perpetrated the crime. The person who they believe perpetrated the crime, let's say person A, it can be arrested. And so there's a lot of asterisks to a lot of what I'm saying, because in certain circumstances, there are crimes that the person doesn't need to be arrested. A person can receive a summons to go to court later. But for the sake of clarity, I will talk about a situation that we may see on Law and Order, because that's a lot of folks' reference point. So this person is arrested. They'll be put into a police cruiser, and they will be driven to the police station first. When they get to the police station, they are booked. That booking process involves getting their photograph taken. It often involves fingerprints. And if the person is being held in a cell, it unfortunately involves a strip search. So this person is held then in a cell, and they are either then driven to the courthouse if it's during business hours, or a clerk, or depending on your county or your state system setup, somebody comes to the police station to make a preliminary determination about whether this person will get bail or not. And I'll explain what bail is in a second. So let's say, again, for the sake of clarity, this crime happens at 11 o'clock in the morning. This person is driven to the courthouse. This person will arrive at the courthouse and will be taken in handcuffs. And mind you, this person is in handcuffs from the moment that they are arrested. This person is taken into the courthouse in handcuffs into the lockup part of the courthouse. And so if anybody has ever been to a courthouse, unless you're an attorney, you probably haven't seen this part of the courthouse. It's often in the basement of the courthouse, but they're essentially a series of cages, and people are inside of those cages, and they're held there until they're brought upstairs to their courtroom, could be next door depending on the courthouse, to see the judge. So this person gets brought in and they're charged with a crime. If they're charged with a crime, that likely means that there's a potential jail sentence involved, which means that they have a right to counsel. So the first thing that would happen, I'll talk about specifically in the Massachusetts system, and it's very likely this is very similar everywhere, just the procedure might be slightly different. So in our system, in the state system, probation will go talk to them first and take a lot of information, but make a preliminary determination as to whether this person is indigent or not, meaning can they afford their own counsel or can they not? If the person is found to not be able to afford their own counsel, they'll be appointed a public defender. If they can afford their own counsel might already be there for what's next, which is called a bail hearing. So what happens next is this person goes before the judge for a bail hearing. Bail hearing is the first step in the justice system process, and in my view, one of the most important steps, because the determination of a bail hearing very often determines the trajectory of this person's involvement with the criminal justice system. So what happens at a bail hearing is this person goes before the judge and the prosecutor reads the allegations to the judge and reads the crimes that this person is charged with. Based on that person, either they have a record or they don't. The prosecutor uses a number of factors in determining this. They will either ask for bail or they won't ask for bail. They quite often ask for bail. So again, let's go forward as if the prosecutor is asking for bail here. The defense attorney will then stand up and give their own argument. They'll talk about this person, who they are, what they do, their community involvement, their job, their children, their family, the reasons why they cannot and should not be held in jail pending the resolution of this matter. At that point, the judge will make a determination whether there will be bail or not. Now, sometimes it will be a splitting the baby. That's a phrase a lot of lawyers like to use, which I find a bit odd, but lawyers are a bit odd. So the splitting the baby, meaning the prosecutor is asking for $100, I'm asking for $0, the judge puts $50. Sometimes that works. Oftentimes it doesn't, because oftentimes if a person is involved in the justice system and they can't afford bail, they can't afford $10 or $50 or $75 or $75,000. They can't afford any of those numbers. So when the bail determination is made, either this defendant is either given bail, meaning they pay an amount of money and they promise that they will come to all of their court hearings. And if they don't come to their court hearing, not only can they get arrested for missing a court hearing, they agree that they will forfeit that money. So this person is either bailed out or they're not. If this person is not bailed out, then they go then to the county facility. And again, I'm speaking specifically about state court. And they're held there during the pendency of their matter. There are a lot of people, for example, right now during the COVID pandemic, who have been held in jail for months and months and months for shoplifting cases. Because once you are held in jail, if and until you can get before a judge and some resolution can happen about your case, and Fahim, I know we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail later on, so I won't go too far into this cash bail issue. Until you can get before a judge and resolve your case, you are held in jail. So as your case progresses, there are several events that can happen before a trial. There can be a motion to suppress hearing, meaning however the evidence was, however the police got the evidence, they did it illegally. That's the allegation for a hearing. There can be a motion to dismiss hearing. The way you have charged this crime, there is no basis in law for how you've charged this crime. There can be a whole host of other hearings, competency hearings, there are all sorts of mitigation questions. Then there's a trial. The trial then, and this is assuming the person doesn't plea out, during the trial, the prosecutor's job is to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that this crime happened. So the prosecutor's job is not to convince a jury that the crime may have happened or that it probably happened, or if it probably happened, this is probably the person who committed it. The number that is thrown around in the justice system is something like a 97% sure that this happened. That's a very high percentage. And it's the prosecutor's job to meet that bar. It's the defense attorney's job to keep the prosecutor in check, to make sure that this person has advocacy and representation, and every piece of evidence is questioned. And the witnesses are questioned about, are you sure you saw this? Or how was this evidence obtained? And, again, there's a lot that can go into a trial, but the basic role of each person, the prosecutor wants a conviction, and the defense attorney's job is to zealously advocate for their client for the best possible resolution for what that client wants.
Right.
Then,
so keeping everything that you just kept, you laid out for us all the way. So obviously after trial, you have a sentencing in which the person is either convicted or not. Right. It seems as if that process is kind of set in stone and seamless. However, we do know that in practice, there are some inequities and discriminatory practices that happen within the justice system. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rahil. Can you kind of explore that from your perspective as someone who works with individuals within the system in a different way?
I do want to, I want to highlight the various places where some of that can get selectively used. But I wonder if actually this really is, Saraa can probably more eloquently pinpoint some of these places, for example, the selective policing processes. I mean, from a psychological perspective, what I can offer is it's not up for debate that we have implicit biases, right? These are fed into us that we've absorbed from the system around us, and they play out in really subtle ways. What becomes really potent is the way these really subtle individual practices begin to stack up, right? There's a systemic level of which communities are actually getting flooded with police and which are not, right? Do you see police cars on every street corner in a suburb? So some of that is because we've internalized some of that policing, and there are lots of rules in those suburbs anyway. But who's actually getting all the policing, despite the fact that everyone is committing crimes, whether it's going 6 miles per hour above the speed limit or driving with a broken taillight? Things that really should be considered safety issues are called crimes. So which ones are getting selectively policed? And then who's going to jail? As Saraa mentioned, a lot of this is before you've been convicted of a crime, right? Who's going to jail, the pretrial process, who's getting, the bail system, who can't afford these $75, let alone the $200, $2,000 that's often set for bail for very simple things, right? Who doesn't have access to get out and therefore cannot really fight their case. Then who takes these plea deals and pleads guilty because they're presented with, do I risk life in prison for something versus just take this deal and spend a little bit of time in jail, even though that is going to completely destroy my life, both socially and economically. And then the sentence lengths and the imprecise dealing out of those sentence lengths, let alone then after the fact, after you've done your time, after you've been traumatized by the system, the fact that you don't, and we'll dig into this a little bit more, all of the discrimination that comes after the fact of coming out of the prison system. But Saraa, I'm curious if you have anything else to add in some of those little places where extreme injustice shows up in the process.
Absolutely. So it goes to something specifically that you said, Rahil, about the bail system particularly. So one of the first instances in which there is a huge disparity between who has access to a fulsome justice experience and who doesn't is who gets a high cash bail and who doesn't. So as far as the inequities that I've witnessed as a public defender and afterward in the criminal justice system, Black and brown, poor people disproportionately, and I really mean it when I say disproportionately, are arrested, are charged, and are held on bail for crimes in this system, which means that poor Black and brown people are spending more time in jail. They are pleading to crimes that they may not have committed. So speaking specifically, I think Rahil was referring to the bail system and what happens when you get bail. So I don't know the statistic off the top of my head, but I will tell you from my own experience and the experience of my colleagues, and I'm sure Rahil has seen this happen as well, the fact that they work with people who are incarcerated and have probably heard this from the people that they work with. When somebody is held on bail, they are much, much, much more likely to plead to a crime that they did not commit. And that is because what often happens is the prosecutor incentivizes that by offering a deal that gets that person out of jail. And we can talk obviously much more, and Rahil can speak much more eloquently to the trauma that folks experience when they're incarcerated. But when somebody is incarcerated, they are constantly being traumatized. And a person who is involved in the justice system is more likely to plead to a crime regardless of whether they committed it, because a prosecutor may offer them what's called a lesser included. So if you're charged with assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, that carries a sentence that is higher than assault and battery. So a prosecutor, and if you are held on bail, a prosecutor might offer you a sweet plea deal to an assault and battery that puts you on probation for 2 years and has the justice system involved in your life for 2 years. And by the way, violation of probation can land you back in the system and incarcerated. But you're so traumatized in that moment being inside that you may take that plea deal. And that person that I'm talking about is very, very often a person of color and a person who doesn't have financial resources.
Rahil, you, first of all, Saraa, thank you so much. And you kind of spoke to something that Rahil alluded to and used implicit bias to the term implicit bias to kind of speak to exactly what you just said. Rahil or Saraa, either one of you all, can you please define what implicit bias means and how that manifests specifically in what Saraa was talking about in terms of a disproportionate amount of low income Black and Brown people going through the system?
So happy to explain that a little more clearly, and also with the caveat that I also want to honor that sometimes we get caught up in talking about implicit bias as the reason for this, when these are also very systemically built in. So with that said, implicit bias, as opposed to explicit bias, means that this is bias that we're not consciously aware of. The Harvard Implicit Association test tests this by your reaction time and associating good and bad to people and what they look like. And these subtle differences in responses tell us the ways that we're biased towards or against certain groups of people with disabilities, who are fat, who are Black or brown, who are low income, et cetera, yeah? And these things are absorbed in us over time. So when I ask you, imagine bringing to mind a picture of a drug dealer in your head, right? Despite the fact that the rates of drug dealing are equal amongst Black and white folks, I can guarantee that in my own mind, despite the fact that I know this, and in perhaps most of us, the first image that comes to mind is a Black person, perhaps Black male, perhaps low income, when none of these actually match the statistics as they show up. But that's been fed to us. It's not our fault. These are fed to us by the movies that we watch, the media, and the particular stories that they choose to share. So over time, this gets built into a framework in the subconscious, so that when the limbic system, the first survival response is elicited, the first availability heuristic, the first image of that idea that comes up in our mind is based on all of those associations that we've already made. And those associations built by all of these systems outside of us. So then that plays out in whether or not we think someone is guilty, for example, as jurors, or in terms of someone being pulled over for a broken taillight. A little white lady in a nice car is going to get very different treatment based on these implicit biases than a Black man, right? And we see that time and time again. The data shows that. All of that said, these implicit biases show up systemically because of the way that they're pooled. And in addition to that, the systems themselves are built. For example, the policing already is in. It's not just that you're more likely to get mistreatment for the broken taillight as a Black person. You're more likely to get pulled over, period, because the police are already in your neighborhood far more than in the suburbs.
Thank you. Saraa, do you have anything to add?
Not much. Rahil gave a really great overview of this. The one note that I wanted to make is another way in which implicit bias may pop up in the lives of the folks watching this webinar is when you're at an airport. So when you're going through the TSA system, particularly if you are someone who's male presenting and South Asian, you may have your bags checked, or you may have that little, thing that they put on your hand to see if there's explosives or whatnot. And, it may not be the case that the TSA person is looking at you and saying, oh, well, gee, they look like so-and-so, so they must be doing something. In theory, that process is randomized. However, the implicit biases that the folks working at TSA might have might be an explanation for why you find yourself being stopped by TSA considerably more than non-South Asian people.
That was a really good example to kind of drive it home and root it within our own experiences to be able to understand another person's perspective. And that kind of moves me on to another question about perspectives, right? Everything that we've talked about right now is geared towards the inequities of individuals who find themselves within the justice system. However, there are crimes being committed, right? And there are individuals on the other side of those crimes, victims, survivors. What about those affected by these crimes? So let's take, for example, the view of the business owner who has been affected by a breaking and entering. At some point, the small business owner has two choices: either pass on the cost to customers or shut down. So can you each of you share your thoughts on this perspective. Rahil, would you like to start?
I just want to start, even before these two choices, just honoring the suffering that comes from being at the receiving end of violence. I mean, I can't imagine as an Ismaili business owner having that happen, or even worrying about that possible violence being inflicted on us. And just starting from rahmah, right? Like deep compassion, not for anyone else yet. Let's focus on us first, right? Deep compassion for ourselves for having to potentially be a victim or a survivor of that violence. I don't wish that sort of violence on anyone. I don't want anyone to receive such violence. In hikmah, for me, the wisdom is also broadening our definition of violence, right? Violence is not just being hit over the head with a club. Violence is also the inability to access healthcare when we need it, the inability to have safe, healthy food. Violence is also not being able to have the money to put food on the table for your kids. Violence is also not being able to have housing to stay in overnight when it's negative 20 degrees in Boston in the winter, right? All of that is also violence. So I'm thinking, I mean, I'm remembering the story that we've all probably heard at some time of the prophet walking by every day and getting trash thrown on him. And then one day that doesn't happen. So he has to go upstairs. So he goes upstairs wondering what's going on. Why isn't this person throwing trash on me? And realizes this person is sick and takes care of them, right? That incredible amount of rahmah that's bigger than for himself, to be able to say, something is wrong here. This change here is telling me that something is wrong. And I'm not asking us to immediately have compassion for the other in that perspective. I would imagine that we can aspire to that. I would also imagine that on the receiving end of that violence, I would be enraged and I would want someone to be punished. I would want that person to pay for hurting me or my family, or hurting my business and putting me at jeopardy of losing my business. And I also imagine that if I were to touch in a little deeper, that anger is protecting something. And I think for me, I would imagine that anger is protecting a lot of hurt. That I don't deserve this, that this isn't fair, right? And I want us to touch into that piece. It isn't fair that we receive this violence. And so we share in the goal that we want to reduce violence in this world. All of us share that goal, I believe, right? And unfortunately, the reality is locking people up, we've increased our incarceration rate 7 times in the last 4 to 5 decades. We're 5% of the world's population, yet we have 25% of the world's incarcerated population. And yet our crime rate isn't going down. So what does that mean? Something is missing, right? So if we begin to ask ourselves, what is the anatomy of violence? What is it that leads someone to commit those acts? And how do we reduce the violence of the world that creates the conditions for someone to need to break and enter, to be able to get enough money to either put food on their table or perhaps get another dose of whatever is going to keep them through the next day so they don't go into withdrawal and die? So how do we instead get them to substance use treatment? How do we instead get them housing? How do we instead get them safe jobs? So that the ultimate goal, invoking both rahmah and hikmah, the act of adl, is to fight for this in a way where you don't actually end up receiving more violence because we have actually addressed the root cause of violence, right?
That was really, really beautiful. And it reminds me of this quote from Dr. Maya Angelou, who says, "I'm a human being. Nothing human can be alien to me." And it sounds like to me, what you said is to look within yourself and feel the pain that you felt within yourself and extend the empathy based on your reaction to individuals that may be similarly situated, but on the other side of that experience. Saraa, do you have any thoughts?
Not many. Rahil's answer was phenomenal. I think the only thing that I would add is I think it's important for us to remember that by having empathy for the person who perpetrates this crime, we are not excusing that. We're not saying that it's okay. We're not saying that we're not letting ourselves have a reaction to it. We're not saying we're not hurt. We're not saying that we don't want some form of justice. What we're doing is reframing what justice means and what justice is, and moving beyond the idea that justice is this person being locked up somewhere where, and we'll touch on this more later, when this person gets out, they're not going to be less likely to commit crime. There are several studies on this. When this person gets out, they may have a renewed substance abuse issue. When this person gets out, they'll have even more trauma than they had when they went in. When this person gets out, they'll be disenfranchised and demoralized with the criminal justice system and the system in general. And the person who had that crime perpetrated against them, that store owner, their life isn't any better for it. It doesn't undo that crime. So if the store owner wants to be able to go to their store and earn an honest day's living, and they want their friends and their family to be able to do the same thing, by having empathy for those who are involved in the justice system, what we can do is move toward a hopeful place where, as Rahil said, the factors that lead somebody to perpetrate this crime are addressed and the crime rate goes down.
Thank you both for sharing your reflections on this. Personally, I'm a survivor of a mass shooting, and it took a lot to look within myself to heal around being angry at the person that committed that crime, especially because I saw death. And I think it speaks to exactly what you just said, Saraa. It speaks to realizing that I do have the right to feel angry, but that no one is coming out better on the other side if we aren't extending empathy to other people. So that kind of leads me to solution seeking a little bit. What are possible solutions and or alternatives to the current practices in the system that you envision would make for a more passionate society? Saraa, would you like to start?
Sure. So the solutions come from the place of empathy. The solutions come from looking at alternative ways to approach justice. So something called restorative justice, which I know that Rahil can speak about as well. So the concept behind restorative justice is the person who is alleged to have perpetrated the crime, the person who is the victim of this crime, and their sort of circles. So their attorneys, their advocates, their social workers, maybe their family, people who were affected by this crime in some way, come together and they meet and they talk and they heal together. And there is a lot of strength in being heard. A lot of times, and I've seen this happen, particularly in domestic violence issues, where I had a client who was alleged to have perpetrated a crime against their partner. And the partner would call my office and say, I don't want them to go to jail. I want them to get treatment. I want them to go to anger management. I want them to manage their addiction issues. I want them to take their mental health medication so that we don't end up in this situation again. Restorative justice allows for that. It allows for a conversation, it allows for folks to come together and, as a community, decide what will actually create healing and what will actually help folks move on. Rahil, I don't know if you want to touch on the restorative justice piece.
Yeah. I mean, that covers it really beautifully. I also want to name that these practices are deeply grounded in circle keeping, deeply grounded in indigenous practices of being in community with each other, right? And so restorative justice is about those interpersonal relationships that work through the healing pieces, where people who have committed harm, committed violence, have to come to terms with what are the consequences of that, what has that led to, and how much change can actually happen when that's done, right? That is really important. And also, not separate from, but in addition to, is the idea of transformative justice. And transformative justice seeks to say, okay, we can't necessarily restore all the relationships. Some things have been broken. And nor do we want to restore things back to the way they were, because the causes and conditions for that violence was already there. So how do we transform society in a way that actually decreases the need for that to happen, right? So again, the anatomy of violence, we need an understanding of the anatomy of trauma, right? No one enters violence first by doing it. I'll repeat that. No one enters violence first by doing it. If someone is committing violence, what violence has been done to them that they are reenacting? What trauma, what experience that was too hard, too difficult for them to metabolize? Biologically, that changes our biological stress response. Our hypothalamic pituitary axis is on overdrive. The cortisol is overflowing in our systems, biologically standardized and over again in tests, right? So biologically, we have this extreme stress response. We have our brain, if this is our brainstem here, our limbic system, fight or flight here, in our neocortex here on top. That's what sort of holds things together, allows us to pay attention, allows us to make strong executive decisions, allows us also on this back right side to be more empathic. When we flip our lid, we're in 100% limbic system activation. When you've continually been traumatized throughout your life, your access to this neocortical system is significantly diminished. So from a biological level, you're in this fight or flight survival mode, so you're making more impulsive, harmful decisions. From a psychological level, your basic trust in the world has decreased. From an attachment theory perspective of psychology, our understanding of being secure in the world, that if we help others, it will come back around, that we can take care of each other, that trust is gone. We must get our own, right? Like that idea of I need to get mine at the expense of everyone else dehumanizes others. That's the biological, the psychological, and the social perspective of then the isolation, the inability to be supported by community, and then to reinforce isolation as punishment, right? The justice system throws you into jail and isolates you from the community that you need to heal through that harm, right? So transformative justice then means, we can't go into this without talking about abolition. So I need to name, I am an abolitionist. I believe in a world without police, in a world without prisons. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, and a famous abolitionist, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. So it's not just saying close all the prisons today, right? It's about building the fabric of society such that we don't need prisons. Talk about Adil, putting everything in its rightful place. No human being's rightful place is a cage, right? So how do we do the healing work? How do we fight for universal healthcare, universal housing, universal food access, universal public education? All of that supports the ability for people not to have to resort to violence. Universal mental health care treatment, substance use treatment. So no one is out there trying to break and enter to get some money so that they can support their drug use, right? All of this is about disease and trauma and harm and how we actually fix that. So for me, the alternatives, can we invoke our imaginations? We're in an imagination battle right now. And right now we're living the imagination of rich white men who have power and who have dehumanized Black and brown folks to such a degree that we don't actually see them as our equals, right? We've done that in our South Asian community as well. It's so easy for us to see Black folks as less than in some way. So yeah, how do we begin to undo that and imagine a world that is different? That doesn't mean tomorrow, but how do we work towards something that is really built in community, that is built in rahma, in hikmah, in adl?
That is, I mean, the way that you framed all of that and then came back around to rooting it in faith is exactly why we're having this conversation today, right? Through the platform that we're using. Shout out to ITREB. That brings me to kind of a concluding set of questions before we do open it up to audience questions. And if each of you could take around 30 seconds to respond, I know that that's a very short amount of time, but everything that you all have been talking about is systemic in ways, right? Everything that you have been talking about may seem like it's beyond us, beyond the individual person to act. So I have two questions for you all. Number one, as we go to the polls on Tuesday, and hopefully if we've already voted, how would you recommend Jamaati members who are interested in this issue to become more aware of policies? That's number one. And then number two, how can we as Ismailis get involved? Saraa, would you like to start?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is the first part of what Fahim said is that the importance of voting. So beyond, I don't want to take for granted that we've all had the opportunity to vote yet. If you haven't voted yet, please vote. Please go make your voice heard. As a US citizen, it is your most powerful tool is your ability to vote. Now, how do you take what you've heard here and in other critical conversation sessions into account when you're voting? The best way to do that is to do your research, to make an informed choice, to understand exactly who you're voting for and what that person stands for, the policies that they intend to enact, what if they've already been involved in politics, what they have already done. When there are questions on your ballot, it's important to research those questions as well. In states where you elect your judges, in Massachusetts, we appoint our judges, but in Florida, I know being from Florida, judges are elected. It's important to look up those judges. What have they done? What policies have, they may not release official policies, but every now and again, a judge will end up in the news for a sentence they did or did not give, for how they treated a person involved in the criminal justice system. Do your research, make your choice an informed choice, because that is your right and your responsibility as a US citizen.
Thank you. Rahil?
Yeah, that says it. We can do our research. We can Google these things. We can look at the platforms and read about them, understand what we're supporting and what we're not supporting. We look around and we see, for example, mass incarceration is not just prisons. It is also the detention centers that's separating children from their families, from their parents, and the amount of trauma that that's causing, especially at that early age, the destruction of secure attachments and what that will mean for how they choose to engage in the world, unless we do the work of healing. So thinking about all of what's happening now and the policies that are being supported in which ways by which folks, Google, that's it. Google what the propositions are locally. How is that supporting Rahma? How is that in alignment with your values as a Muslim to support all beings? We go back to Adil. We go back to Malik al-Ashtar and that letter that Hazrat Ali wrote. It is a stunning vision of what does it mean to support those who are most destitute, who are most in need of support. And if we are not fighting for that, are we really living our faith? So for me, my question is, do the research and see what aligns with our faith.
Thank you so much for concluding on kind of charging our Ismaili siblings with an action to use their voice if they are US citizens to go to the ballots and to think critically about the decisions that we're making and the way that it can impact our local communities and the national landscape. With everything that's been spoken about, we've received many questions from our audience, which I'm sure we would love to hear your insights on. With that, let me turn to my first question. Is it possible to get justice by working through the state and its systems? Saraa, would you like to begin?
Fahim, you have to give me the hard question. It depends on your definition of justice, I think. I think it's important to understand that by going through the state and its system, you as the person who would be seeking justice are not in charge. The prosecutor is in charge. The police are in charge. So I think that maybe folks who are not involved with the justice system in some way, and maybe, as I said, have only viewed it on Law and Order, may have a misconception that if you go to the police and you make a report about a crime and then you do some sort of informal restorative justice or something like that, and you decide, you know what, I feel whole, I feel healed, I don't need this person to continue to be involved in the justice system. And if you call the prosecutor and you say that, that won't dismiss the case. That won't end the case. And I can tell you, I've seen that happen countless times. So it's important to understand that once it's involved in the state system, it's based on the discretion of the police and the prosecutor. That doesn't mean that the answer that I'm giving to this question is no. I just think it's an important thing to inform folks about, and let that be present in your mind if you find yourself involved in the justice system. And as far as if something, if there is a case progressing through the justice system as it is structured at this moment, and you do want justice, you should and you can make your voice heard. Many prosecutors' offices have what's called a victim witness advocate, or somebody with a title similar to that, whose job it is to talk to you. If you are, God forbid, the victim of a crime, you have an advocate in the prosecutor's office whose job it is to talk to you. And you can also bring your own advocate if you want to retain counsel and have that person interface with the prosecutors involved in your case. It's a way to make your voice heard. And another way is to suggest alternatives to incarceration yourself. For example, restorative justice, like we just spoke about.
Rahil, any reflections?
With the system as it is currently built, we've seen time and time again that those who are survivors of harm have actually felt wholly inadequately supported by the current systems. They have felt that actually I did not get the justice that I was wanting. This revenge, this punishment, this locking up has actually done nothing to heal my heart, nor has it done anything to really heal them. Admittedly, sometimes it's the only action that we can take. And sometimes we take what we can get. So no shame to folks who are using the system, of course. And yet I invite you to reimagine. I invite you to consider, what would it be like if, when harm was caused, we had a crisis team of conflict mediators who have built relationships with each of us in our small communities, right? Or that if a mental health crisis breaks out, that we can call a mental health crisis team within our communities who can de-escalate the situation, who are experts in that de-escalation, and provide treatment and gather access to resources in the ways that are needed. So I'm not saying that this is going to happen tonight, tomorrow, but how do we start building systems that are built on relationship, that don't have us rely on state-sanctioned violence, that don't have us rely on the state right now and its systems? So perhaps, maybe there are times where we can start imagining, this Black person who is knocked out and may need some Narcan because they're in an opiate overdose. Do I need to call the police? Is there someone who has access to Narcan? Do we have access to Narcan? Is that something that we have in our bags that we can spray into the nose easily of someone who's on the street? How do we start looking at alternatives to calling the police? In some communities, often have alternate lines where you can get an ambulance through the fire station, where you don't have to call 911 and bring police into the picture, when for a Black man with this opiate overdose, they could end up dead, right? There are places like Boston has ACT teams, has acute community treatment teams that are mental health experts for acute cases that don't have to involve the police and run the risk that we've seen too many times recently.
Thank you both. I think that the undercurrent of this entire conversation is turning the understanding that we have of justice on its head to think critically about extending an empathetic lens to the system, not to the system, but to the people who are going through the system, and finding healing alternatives. This next question is a more technical question, and one of you all can answer this so that we can go to some more reflexive question. But can you please explain selective enforcement?
Sure, I can jump in here. So I assume this person means selective enforcement of crimes by the police. And that goes back to the unconscious bias piece that Rahil spoke about earlier. So in the hypothetical that I gave at the beginning of this webinar, the situation in which person A and B are fighting on the street and police are called. Now imagine a situation in which person A is Black and person B is white. Without having, you know, known either of these people or having been present during the altercation, a police officer knowing that the white person may have been the perpetrator of the crime, but choosing not to arrest them and choosing to arrest the Black person is an example of selective enforcement. Another example is when Rahil was talking about the situation in which someone is pulled over for a busted tail light. And that's a really good example of, you know, if you are driving a nice car in the suburbs and your tail light is not working, a police officer not pulling you over, versus if you are not driving a nice car and you're not in the suburbs and you're maybe in a what's called low income community and you're having a busted tail light, and that's the same crime in theory. Well, it's a civil citation in most places, but it's the same issue. It's the same reason that police may pull you over, but the police pulling the person over who is driving in a low income community and not pulling the person over who is driving in a suburb, that's another example of selective enforcement. And a further step on that is if that person is pulled over, if the police officer who pulls over the person in the suburb walks up to the driver's side vehicle and smells what may be an illegal substance in that state, not choosing to search the car, versus if the police officer walks up to the driver's side in the low income part of the city and smells what may be an illegal substance in that state and choosing to search that car. Another example of selective enforcement.
Selective enforcement, I might add on, is, for example, my partner and I driving in Georgia about a month ago, middle of the night, no one around. My partner, she had never heard of the move over law. I'm not sure if all you all are familiar with it. I imagine not. There was flashing lights on the side of a single like construction worker, orange lights or something. And we passed by it, and immediately the police flagged us, came down from behind us. I guess they were waiting for someone to do this. Came in, and my partner showed her out-of-state license plate, first time in the state. And this police officer, with, mind you, his face in our car without a mask amidst this pandemic, yelling at us, I kindly asked, "I'm sorry, sir, can we get a better understanding of what we're being pulled over for? Give me your license and then we can talk about it." Coming back, perhaps seeing 3 brown folks in the car, perhaps seeing some of the bumper stickers on the back of our car, and then choosing to actually give us a ticket for $480. And then the next day, seeing a whole line of traffic of construction workers in a big sign that actually says move over, in 15 cars in the time that we were there passing by, and getting no such ticket despite police there. That is selective enforcement.
Thank you, Rahil and Saraa. Something that I've really appreciated about this entire conversation is that you're rooting it in your own experiences, because it really drives it home that these things actually happen. And this is why having conversations about this stuff is very, very, very important, because it will force us to think critically about how we as Ismailis can act to navigate what's happening. This next question leads a little bit from what we were just talking about, but offers a different perspective that I invite you all to reflect on with me. So regarding restorative justice, transformative justice, if we don't rely on the police, how do we hold those accountable for things beyond just getting pulled over by the police, for example, like child abuse? For example, especially if the abuser is not driven to self-accountability.
It's a fantastic question. And a larger question for the ideas of abolition, like, what do we do with the rapists, the serial killers? Those are common concerns. I hear you. My question for you is, what are we doing about them now? And I want us to take that question seriously, right? This is hard work to figure out and reimagine what a different world could look like. That's not going to happen tomorrow. It takes reimagining, it takes work, it takes trial and error. We've done hundreds of years in this project of prison. It didn't exist actually in the same way a few hundred years ago. It was primarily a holding place for corporal punishment, including capital punishment, death. But it was never the punishment in and of itself. That's actually a recent project. We've tried it, it doesn't work. The irony is we think that we're getting justice somehow. The vast majority of sexual assault cases are not even reported. The vast majority of those that are thrown out before they're actually taken seriously and brought to court. The vast majority of those that are brought to court are acquitted. So the vast majority of people causing these harms are not actually being taken care of in our system currently. Even if we're not thinking empathically about who is it that causes harm in that way and how do we heal them. Even from the perspective of how do we avoid this harm happening to the rest of us. Even if we just take that limited perspective, what we're doing now is not working. These people are not locked up in our system, right? Only the smallest, tiniest amount of them are. And then when they're released, they will continue to cause harm, now either even further traumatized, right? So my question to you is, obviously right now, what we have right now doesn't work. I'm not saying that we don't need boundaries. Someone that is causing harm to folks should have boundaries, should not be able to be engaging with folks who they could harm again, right? But that doesn't have to look like punishment. In psychiatry, if someone is at acute risk of harm to themselves or others, acute risk of suicide or homicide, we take them inpatient to a psychiatric unit and treat them. Granted, there's an argument that could be made that in many ways, inpatient psychiatry is still carceral, is still like jail. But the point being, and what we need to work on and continue to undo, is that it's not about punishment. It's about healing, right? And that's what we need to invoke. So there might be places where people need, as someone with child who's causing child abuse, needs to be in a place where they are not allowed to have access to kids. And not everyone is going to want to do transformative justice. I agree. And these are the messy, nitty-gritty parts that we have to figure out collectively. I invite you to do that with me, to do this reimagining and see how that could happen, and perhaps build a world where that person doesn't have the traumas and the causes and conditions that lead them to think it's okay to harm children in that way. This is the long haul. This is a long project. And right now, what we have is not working. What we have is not addressing those concerns. So let's build something together that does.
What a beautiful way to extend empathy to that question, and recognizing that, you know, in terms of what Saraa alluded to earlier, that we can still feel, you know, anger towards injustices like that. We can still feel frustrated towards a child abuser. But the question is who's coming out better on the opposite end of this, if we're only thinking about this as a punishment, right? Someone goes through the justice system kind of way. We have to be thinking about ways in which people don't perpetuate harms like this, and think empathetically to how we can reform in a way that addresses those concerns instead of just locking people up. Saraa, I want to turn to my next question, and this is specifically for you. Through a legal framework, can you talk about the need for people with significant resources who perpetuate harm to agree to transformative justice and buy into learning how to center the experiences of marginalized people and be held accountable to help building systemic solutions to inequities? So without consent, are transformative justice interventions possible? And then Rahil, you can speak from a mental health framework.
Sure. So I just want to be clear on what the question is. It's folks with significant resources who are perpetrating crime.
So I think that the question is essentially asking, how can we, from a place of centering, apparently the person who asked the question said yes.
Yes, thank you for that clarification, Shanaz. So what's interesting about folks with significant resources who are perpetrating crime, let's take an example for the college admission scandal. Aunt Becky, Full House, we all know about her, right? So when cases like that get so much attention, so much media attention, what we often see is folks using their financial resources to have a significantly different experience in the criminal justice system than somebody without financial resources. And to the extent that somebody with financial resources is perpetrating crime, and what they can do, from what, as I understand your question, what they can do for the folks who are involved in the justice system who don't have resources. I think normalizing things like restorative justice and normalizing alternatives to incarceration by exposing people to it, and exposing people to it by using these options in very high profile cases. And so, we as a people, as a society, we normalize things by being exposed to them. We understand things by being exposed to them in reality and not in theory. So if we hear about somebody who's very famous or very rich or very both, charged with a crime, and then we hear about a way in which they utilize one of these systems that didn't involve incarceration and, did a restorative justice circle and would be willing to share their experience on the person who perpetrated the crime, what their experience was, and the person who was the victim of this crime, what their experience was, then hopefully more people understanding it, that will lead to more people supporting it. And that's how it trickles down to the people in our society who need it most and the most marginalized populations.
What I love about transformative justice is it keeps an eye to the systemic factors. Not every individual is going to have the buy-in. That's true. And I want us to admit that this work is messy and hard. It's not always going to be easy. And it's not going to happen overnight, as I've said a million times now, probably. People with significant resources, there are memes and cartoons of the judge. Well, is the defendant rich or poor? And there's literally a law book for the rich and then a separate law book that the judge is holding for the poor. I wonder, ironically, if we can actually learn from some of the compassion that we offer folks who are rich in the justice system. But I want to be clear that compassion does not mean letting go of accountability. As Saraa has said, accountability is still crucial regardless, right? It's not about punishment. Punishment doesn't work. We know that. Putting your kid in timeout actually doesn't decrease the amount of times that they do said act. They might hide it from you. They might not do it when you're not looking, but it doesn't actually break the fundamental behavior. It has to be reinforced in other ways. So how does compassion then turn up with fire? I don't want us to get rid of our anger. Anger is important. It tells us that something is wrong, right? But I want us to be angry at the systems that led to so-and-so richer person expecting that they're not subject to the same laws. I want us to be mad at the injustices that led to so-and-so a poor person causing an act of violence, right? I want that anger to be there, and I want it to come full force, because then compassion can arise with clarity, with fierceness. And so a compassionate framework for that would mean all of those pieces and preventing it before it happens, perhaps.
Thank you both for your reflections. And that wraps up our audience question and answer, but it serves as a beginning. It serves as a starting point to start to think critically, if you are already not, about the topic we discussed today, and in particular, how it's rooted in the values of our faith, and how we as Ismailis can move forward knowing that we have the power to use the ballot, to use the resources that we have beyond the election to create substantive change around the criminal justice system. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. As I said, hopefully this is just the start of this critical conversation. And today was such a treat for me, as I hope it was for all of you all watching. Thank you again. Now, a couple of announcements before you go. In the chat box, you'll find some resources shared by the panelists. You will also find some voting resources. You can check your registration status and any other questions that you may have at the.ismaili.USA/vote. You can also call our hotline for support at 202-854-VOTE. Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd, And do note that early voting is ongoing in some states. Use your vote, use your voice. Finally, please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen as you leave. Thank you, and Yali Matat.